Europe, winter, 1944. The war machine had ground to a halt, frozen not by the snows of the Ardennes, but by a paralyzing stalemate of intelligence. High above the English Channel, the sleek aluminum birds of the Royal Air Force navigated a sky thick with both flak and an unbearable sense of repetition. Every sortie was a gamble, every radio frequency a potential trap. They knew the Germans were listening. They knew the Germans were adapting. But what they did not know was the nature of the whisper that had begun to leak the most protected secrets of the Allied advance. This was not a failure of decryption. Bletchley Park, the silent, beating heart of the Allied intelligence, had turned the Enigma machine into a predictable schoolyard cipher. Yet the strategic moves of the Wehrmacht on the Western Front were becoming eerily prescient. Fuel depots were moved hours before bombing runs. Convoys were rerouted moments before U-boat sightings. It was a pattern so precise, so unnervingly accurate, that it defied the known limits of German intelligence gathering. The irony was devastating. They had broken the machine, only to be confounded by the mind. The suspicion fell on a breach of the most unimaginable kind. A leak, not from within the Western world, but from the forgotten, complex alliance of the Axis powers. Specifically, the Shadow of the Pacific, a war fought with entirely different technologies and ideologies, seemed to have somehow extended its reach into the meticulous, grid-like conflict of Europe. The setting for this dark anomaly was a nondescript, heavily guarded facility in the British countryside, officially a repatriation centre for European internees, unofficially a holding pen for Axis prisoners with specialized knowledge. Among the handful of high-value individuals, there was one who stood out as an historical and logistical impossibility. Subject 94T, a Japanese woman, a linguist, but more critically an expert in emerging electromagnetic field analysis, captured under the most mysterious circumstances in the chaos following the fall of Singapore, and somehow, through an unimaginable series of bureaucratic transfers, ending up on British soil. Her name, stripped down to a numerical designation, was almost forgotten. Her true identity, her precise knowledge, and the very reason for her presence in the European theatre were the most fiercely guarded secrets of the intelligence community. The British officers, steeped in the cultural biases of their time, largely dismissed her as a curiosity, a logistical error. A geisha for the generals, perhaps, now just a piece of human flotsam, one major was recorded as saying in a confidential memo. What they failed to grasp was that this seemingly frail figure was a product of a world so far removed from their own that they lacked the conceptual framework to understand her value. She was trained in technologies far more theoretical than the radar systems they relied upon, systems based on frequency manipulation and pulse detection that the British were only just beginning to conceptualize. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was a live, breathing piece of advanced intellectual property. The facility was a place of oppressive silence, a silence broken only by the crunch of boots on the gravel paths and the incessant, high-pitched static from the security room's radios. She lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, her eyes, often lowered in cultural deference, constantly tracking the movements of her captors. She had given them a cover story, a secretary, mistakenly caught up in the war's retreat. But her hands, the hands of an engineer, had betrayed her. They were too clean, too precise, too unused to the manual labor of a clerk. Her technical drawings, discovered hidden within a bamboo scroll, were not of aircraft, but of intricate wave filters and directional antennae. The irony was reaching its peak. The British were using her to test the resilience of their own security, unknowingly allowing her to observe the very vulnerabilities the Germans were exploiting. Every conversation, every psychological evaluation was, for her, a piece of data. Her silence was not submission. It was espionage by omission. The air around her was thick with the scent of fear, her own, suppressed and contained, and the growing systemic fear of the Allied command as their dominance began to slip. The thesis of this story is simple, yet profound. Sometimes, the greatest strategic threat is not the visible enemy on the front lines, but the intellectual ghost placed behind your own. The Allies saw a woman who thought no one wanted her. What they missed was the silent, devastating power she held. power rooted in the most secretive, darkest corners of Japanese industrial warfare. This entire suffocating arrangement was about to be fractured by the only force capable of transcending technology and strategy: innocence. If this kind of deeply researched and detailed narrative appeals to you, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It's the best way to support the creation of these high-quality, historical deep dives. Now, let's return to the shadow hanging over the British intelligence community. The prisoner, designated 94T, was officially known by the name Kenji, a deliberate choice by her captors to mask her gender in the records, a small clinical attempt to dehumanize and categorize her as just another cog in the massive war machine. But her reality was far more complex. Her true name was Aiko Sato, a brilliant cryptographer and telecommunication specialist who had been attached to a naval intelligence unit tasked with studying early British radar systems captured in Southeast Asia. Her presence in Europe was the result of a desperate, ill-fated attempt by the Japanese Imperial Navy to transfer critical technological data via submarine to their German allies. The rendezvous was betrayed, the U-boat sunk, and Aiko, one of the few survivors, was recovered by a British destroyer. Aiko's world was a 10x12-foot room in the annex of the sprawling British estate. The silence was agonizing, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic clang of a pump station, a reminder of the immense industrial power she was fighting against. Her days were a blur of bland meals, and the interrogations that were less about extracting information and more about psychological mapping. She spoke little, offering only the required minimum in flawless, clipped English. Major Alistair Finch, the lead intelligence officer assigned to Aiko, understood that she was not a standard POW. Finch was a man of the old guard, a classicist who saw war as a contest of maneuver, not mathematics. He dismissed the technical drawings found with her as theoretical Japanese nonsense, believing the Pacific theater to be technologically inferior. "They fly glorified kites, Major," he'd scoffed to his subordinates. "What could this woman possibly tell us about magnetrons or frequency hopping?" This inherent bias was the very chink in the Allied armor Aiko exploited. She fed them what they expected: basic tactical information, carefully curated facts about logistical bottlenecks in the Japanese Navy. She was a master of the Ichigo strategy, the calculated distraction. But outside the high walls of the facility, the war raged on, impacting the lives of everyone in the immediate vicinity. One such life was that of Eleanor Ellie Davies, a sharp, inquisitive 10-year-old girl. Ellie's father was the head groundskeeper of the estate, and her mother served as a laundress in the main house, a detail that granted the family a rare, unsettling proximity to the prison annex. Ellie was a child of the war, wary, independent, and possessing an extraordinary capacity to see what others chose to ignore. Ellie's routine was shaped by the rhythms of the place. She often sat by the overgrown hedge separating the facility's gardens from the staff quarters, sketching in a worn notebook. The officers saw a child. Aiko, watching from the heavily barred high window of her cell during her brief supervised outdoor time, saw a quiet observer. She saw the intense focus in the girl's eyes as she drew the details of the surrounding foliage, a scientist's eye for pattern and structure. The first significant interaction was accidental, born of a moment of carelessness and a flash of shared, unburdened curiosity. During Aiko's limited exercise period, a sudden gust of wind caught a small, carefully folded origami crane Aiko had made from a scrap of paper, a habit she maintained as a mental exercise in precision. The wind carried the tiny paper bird over the low wire fence and dropped it near the hedge where Ellie was sketching. The guard, a young, nervous private, barked at Aiko to ignore it. Aiko, however, stopped, her eyes fixed on the crane. Ellie, seeing the guard's agitation and sensing the deep, unspoken meaning of the paper object, picked it up. She looked at Aiko, not with the typical wide-eyed fear the facility's staff exhibited, but with a pure, unadulterated curiosity. She didn't speak. She simply placed the crane gently on the fence post. It was a gesture of profound respect, acknowledging a creation without needing to understand its origin. Aiko returned to her cell that day with a barely perceptible shift in her demeanor. She had been seen, not as Subject 94T, not as a symbol of the enemy, but as a person whose small creation held value. This seemingly insignificant event began to tear at the edges of the rigid strategic wall Aiko had built around her own survival. The calculated espionage became complicated by a sliver of unexpected human connection, a vulnerability she knew she could not afford, but one she could not entirely suppress. The irony was setting the stage for the dramatic twist. The technical expert, who could unravel entire Allied strategies, was now being disarmed by a simple, silent kindness. Ellie, on the other hand, was now consumed by the mystery of the quiet woman who made paper birds. She began to observe Aiko with a new intensity, noting the precise, controlled way she moved, the almost surgical manner in which she folded her blanket. The child, driven by an instinct for pattern recognition, was beginning to piece together a puzzle that the entire British intelligence establishment had overlooked. Aiko Sato was not just a prisoner, she was an observer of unparalleled skill. The intelligence stalemate deepened. The losses of strategic assets, a fleet of Mosquito fighter bombers on a reconnaissance run, the destruction of a critical American supply train in France, were now being measured in blood and material. Field reports confirmed the terrifying accuracy of the German early warning system. It was as if the Wehrmacht possessed a sixth sense, a predictive capability that allowed them to redeploy defenses with near-perfect timing. Major Finch's frustration was palpable. He was fixated on the physical, demanding more high-altitude photo reconnaissance and ground infiltration. The true battle, however, was occurring in the intangible realm of electromagnetism, and the ghost of the floor sat in a single vital piece of Allied technology, the GEE navigation system. The GEE system, a marvel of early radar-based navigation, relied on fixed ground stations transmitting precise, synchronized radio pulses. By measuring the time difference between these pulses, Allied aircraft could determine their position with unprecedented accuracy, even through cloud cover. It was the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign. What Aiko Sato knew, and what the British were desperately slow to accept, was that the GEE system's success was also its greatest vulnerability. It broadcasted its location and, crucially, its operating frequency with every pulse. Aiko's unit, before her capture, had been developing sophisticated passive reception technology, devices that could not only receive the GEE pulses, but could also calculate the difference in signal strength and phase shift as the aircraft moved, effectively turning the aircraft's own navigation signal into a tracking beacon for the enemy. In her isolation, Aiko began to draw again, not on the officially sanctioned paper, but on the smoothed, dried soap from the bathroom, an ephemeral canvas that vanished with a splash of water. Her drawings were intricate diagrams of wave front distortion and phase-locked loop circuits. She was mentally simulating the German countermeasures, predicting the precise frequency and modulation they would use to inject false GE pulses, leading Allied bombers dozens of miles off course, straight into waiting anti-aircraft concentrations. The historical irony was cruel. The Allies believed they were technologically untouchable, pioneering the age of radar, while the Axis, through meticulous study and the transfer of theoretical physics, often ignored by the military high command on both sides, were developing the means to weaponize that very innovation. A German engineer, Dr. Hans Müller, working near Berlin, was indeed struggling to finalize a highly complex, portable jamming unit, codenamed Klangbild, sound image. Müller was missing a single, crucial variable, a timing sequence relating to the Allied pulse repetition frequency, PRF, that Aiko had calculated years ago. A small, seemingly insignificant detail that stood between a failed prototype and a functional, strategic weapon. Aiko was aware of the technical gap she represented. Her reluctance to speak was born not of malice, but of a calculated nationalistic duty. Her silence was a protective shield for her nation's intellectual asset. She was a weapon in stasis. Meanwhile, the mundane routine of the prison continued to provide unexpected channels of communication. Ellie, the groundskeeper's daughter, had moved from merely observing to a silent engagement. She had noticed the small, almost microscopic scratches Aiko made on the stone sill of her window during her exercise time. They weren't letters, but geometric shapes, a series of nested squares, then a repeating, uneven sine wave. To the guards, it was meaningless doodling. To Ellie, an instinctively perceptive child, it was a code. Ellie, using her sketchpad, began to mirror the shapes back, drawing them in the dirt near the fence, then meticulously erasing them before the guards approached. It was a game of shadows and lines, a shared, silent language of geometric symmetry. One day, Aiko took a greater risk. She had saved a tiny fragment of charcoal from the burnt ends of the mess hall's firewood. During her outdoor period, she pressed the charcoal fragment into the dirt near the corner of the fence, quickly covering it with a loose stone. It was a gesture of desperation. The information she needed to pass was not to the Germans, but a crucial technical detail she had to confirm for her own safety, a warning about her own cover story. Ellie found the stone. Underneath it was not a message, but a tiny, perfect charcoal drawing of a chrysanthemum flower, the symbol of the emperor. But underneath the flower, Aiko had drawn a set of 3 tiny, non-aligned dots that looked like a typographical error. To the uninitiated, they meant nothing, but Aiko knew. Those dots represented a specific 3-part cipher key she had created for her unit. If Ellie showed that drawing to anyone, Allied or Axis, the drawing itself would serve as a powerful identifier, confirming Aiko's high-value status and putting her in lethal danger, or conversely, confirming her identity to a potential rescue mission. The child now held a piece of information that could ignite a diplomatic and military crisis. The technical ghost in the machine was about to gain a voice, an unwitting, innocent messenger who did not understand the language of war, only the language of connection. The stakes were raised. The latest German operation, a swift surgical destruction of a specialized depot storing proximity fuses, had convinced the British High Command that the intelligence leak was not just tactical, but technical. Someone knew their most cutting-edge inventory. Major Finch, under intense pressure, was forced to confront his own biases. The Japanese secretary was the only Axis POW with a demonstrable background in advanced electronics captured in the European theater. Finch ordered a deep, covert psychological operation. They moved Aiko to a new, more isolated holding area designed to simulate a compromised position. Leaky pipes, flickering lights, the sound of machinery being disassembled and reassembled next door. The goal was to break her composure, to find the crack in the facade of stoic resignation. Aiko, however, recognized the theatricality of the environment. She was trained to withstand harsher conditions. But the isolation was a double-edged sword. It heightened her vigilance, but also cut her off from her only emotional anchor, the silent observation of Ellie Davies. The daily routine was broken, and with it, Aiko's ability to monitor the outside world through the smallest, shared details. Ellie, sensing the absence, was in a quiet panic. She knew Aiko had been moved. The small, charcoal chrysanthemum drawing she possessed felt heavy in her hand, a secret too vast for a child. She had analyzed the 3 dots. Her young, pattern-focused mind realized they did not fit the symmetry of the flower. They were an error, a deliberate mistake. Driven by an inexplicable urgency, Ellie decided to communicate. Her access to the staff quarters meant she sometimes helped her mother in the laundry room, which had a seldom-used service alley that ran adjacent to the annex's perimeter fence. The timing had to be precise. The risk, absolute. That evening, a dense coastal fog rolled in, blanketing the estate in a silence that muffled sound and confused the patrol patterns. Ellie slipped out, armed only with her charcoal drawing and a child's intense determination. She located Aiko's new window, higher, smaller, and shielded by a deep, dark overhang. Standing on an overturned bucket, she was still too low. She was frozen in place, staring up at the dark glass, the charcoal fragment of the chrysanthemum clutched in her hand. Suddenly, a sound. Not a boot, but the faint, rhythmic scraping of an object against stone. Aiko, meticulously rubbing the edges of her blanket against the sill to create a sound pattern. A signal. Ellie felt a surge of adrenaline. She knew she had mere seconds. In a soft voice, barely a breath, Ellie repeated the precise, short phrase she had heard the intelligence officers use when discussing the mysterious POW. Subject 94T. She paused, listening to the silence. Then, she spoke the words that had been building inside her, the words that came from seeing the human being behind the designation. "Can you stay with us now?" It was a question of staggering innocence, one that cut through the strategic and national divides of the war. It was not an interrogation. It was an offer of sanctuary. Inside the dark room, Aiko froze. The 3 years of rigorous training, the patriotic fervor, the calculated coldness she had maintained, all of it momentarily shattered. The phrase, "stay with us," had no place in her reality. It was a lapse, a failure in the psychological warfare she was waging against herself. Aiko knew that the walls of her room were lined with microphones. She knew that any response could be fatal. But the sheer weight of that innocent question, "Can you stay with us now?" demanded an answer. The Major and his team were listening, expecting a breakdown, a confession. Instead, Aiko used the language they couldn't understand: technology and poetry. She took the small porcelain teacup from her dinner tray and, with a controlled, precise movement, tapped it against the brick wall. Not randomly, but in a specific rhythm, a long, short, long, long sequence. She repeated it 3 times. It was a modified Morse code rhythm, but the sound was too subtle, too close to the background noise for the British microphones to isolate as speech. But Ellie, outside, heard it, and in her mind, the simple rhythm echoed the 3 non-aligned dots on the chrysanthemum drawing. Confirmation. Aiko had taken the greatest risk of her imprisonment. By subtly confirming the existence of the 3-dot cipher key, she had signaled to the child that the information she possessed was genuine and dangerous. She was telling Ellie, not in words, but in the rhythm of the technological ghost, that she was indeed the Subject 94T they were looking for, and that her knowledge was both a threat and a source of profound despair. The British interrogators, reviewing the tapes later, noted a brief, irregular metallic noise followed by an immediate return to silence. They logged it as structural settling. Their technological bias had made them deaf to the communication that had just passed. A technical spy had confirmed her identity to a child, not through words, but through a rhythm of sound that only another pattern-seeking mind could decode. The greatest secret of the European intelligence front had just been confirmed by a teacup and a girl who refused to see an enemy. The stakes were now astronomical. Aiko had confirmed her identity and the existence of the cipher key to Ellie. Ellie, without understanding the military significance, now knew the woman was important and in danger. The connection, once based on curiosity, had mutated into a fragile, high-risk alliance. The next day, Major Finch's team, reviewing the tapes and the growing pile of circumstantial evidence regarding the German sixth sense, decided to take a dangerous leap. They began to feed Aiko subtly false technical data during her supervised reading time, outdated schematics of the GEE system, deliberately mislabeled frequencies. Their goal was to see if she corrected the errors, thereby revealing her true expertise. Aiko, noticing the deliberate mistakes, understood immediately. They were baiting her. This new development, however, coincided with an event that threatened the entire operation. Ellie's mother was moved to a new assignment at a different facility due to staffing issues. Ellie was to be sent to an aunt in London, a sudden, permanent disruption. This was the moment of ultimate crisis for the tenuous human bond. Ellie knew she had to act. That afternoon, during a brief, rain-soaked moment when Aiko was being escorted across the courtyard, Ellie found her chance. She darted out from a supply shed, holding the charcoal drawing and a small, rusted pin she had found. As she ran past, she spoke 2 short, rehearsed phrases. 3 dots, need light. Aiko, without breaking stride, understood the urgency. The 3 dots were her cipher key. Need light meant Ellie needed a way to preserve or communicate the information safely. The rusted pin was the answer. A tool. Aiko knew her only path to temporary life-saving sanctuary was to cooperate enough to earn limited privileges, but not enough to compromise her strategic value. She shifted her strategy from pure silence to calculated disclosure. In her next interrogation, she deliberately corrected one small error on the false schematics, a minor labeling error regarding a capacitor's tolerance, not a frequency. It was a technical offering, a piece of small, digestible truth designed to build trust. Major Finch took the bait. "She's cooperating," he reported, relieved. As a reward, Aiko was granted 1 hour of occupational therapy per week, supervised time in the facility's small, disused potting shed, supposedly to calm her nerves. This was Aiko's objective. The potting shed overlooked a rarely used section of the boundary fence, near the old, hollowed-out oak tree where Ellie often played. The first session was a tense, silent affair. Aiko was watched closely. She worked with dirt and clay, her hands moving with the precision of an engineer, not a gardener. She was establishing a new, covert communication channel. Ellie knew that to help Aiko, she had to understand the language of the enemy. She began to observe the technical staff, listening to their jargon, hertz, kilocycles, power factor. She was attempting to cross the intellectual gap the war had created. The breakthrough came when Aiko left her first message, hidden in a small, fired clay pot she was allowed to place on the shed windowsill. The guard merely saw a piece of pottery. Inside the dirt, Aiko had subtly etched the following: a perfect, tiny reproduction of the 3 dots, and next to them, the symbol for wavelength lambda, the universal symbol for electromagnetic frequency. Ellie found the pot later that evening, using her own work pass to access the area. She understood the message. The 3 dots were a cipher for a specific frequency, a code for something that traveled on a wave. She took her rusted pin and etched a single mark next to the lambda symbol, a question mark. Aiko's next message was the most crucial. She had to warn the Allies about the Klangbild jammer, not to save them, but to prevent the strategic blunder that would likely lead to her immediate execution once her silence was deemed useless. In the next pot, hidden beneath a loose layer of soil, was a single, tiny, perfectly folded piece of rice paper. On it, etched with charcoal, was an intricate, highly simplified drawing of a tuned circuit, a specific arrangement of an inductor and capacitor. Next to it, the numbers: 2, 35 MHz. This was the terrifying truth. 2, 35 MHz was the precise frequency range used by the British in the initial warm-up phase of the GE pulse, the brief moment of vulnerability when the German Klangbild jammer was designed to hit. Aiko was giving them the exact technical detail Dr. Miller was missing. Ellie, looking at the schematics, felt a surge of confusion. She knew the number was important, technical, but she didn't know what to do with it. She only knew she had to take the information out of the compound. The irony was now layered and complex. Aiko, the Japanese spy, was providing the enemy with critical defensive data to survive, but she was delivering it not to a general or a cryptographer, but to a 10-year-old girl whose only weapon was her innocence and a rusted pin. The espionage had crossed the line into human instinct, a desperate warning shot fired across the battlefield of secrets. The transfer order for Ellie was scheduled for the next morning. Time was running out. Ellie had the key frequency, 2, 35 MHz, and the cipher identifier, the 3 dots, but no mechanism to deliver it to anyone who would understand its strategic value. She knew she couldn't show the rice paper to her parents or any of the low-level staff. The penalty for dealing with a high-value POW was treason. Her only option was to use a channel no one would suspect, the open, chaotic channel of the public school system. Ellie had been tasked by her teacher with submitting a final, detailed drawing of a plant specimen before she left for London. This was her cover. She carefully transferred the information onto her submission. The technical data was concealed within the biological drawing of a common 5-petaled field rose. 1. The 3 dots, cipher. She drew the 5 petals of the rose. On the 3rd petal, she placed 3 tiny, non-aligned dots of ink, deliberately making them look like a smudged error or a speck of dirt. The dots represented the source key. Aiko Sato. 2. The frequency. She labeled the plant specimen. The standard scientific label for a wild rose is Rosa canina. Ellie, using her most precise handwriting, wrote the label as Rosa canina 235 MHz. It was a preposterous label, an amalgam of botany and physics, designed to look like the mistake of an overly ambitious child mixing up her school lessons. The 235 MHz frequency was clearly written, but contextually meaningless. She submitted the drawing to her teacher, Ms. Penelope Atherton, a former mathematics lecturer who had taken up teaching primary school during the war. Ms. Atherton was known for her meticulous attention to detail and an almost obsessive commitment to correcting errors. Ellie's final act of the night was to communicate her success to Aiko. In the staff latrine, she used the rusted pin to scratch a tiny, barely visible symbol into the mirror, a single bold checkmark. A sign of transmission confirmed. Meanwhile, back at the facility, Major Finch's team was beginning to close in. The correction Aiko made on the capacitor tolerance was confirmed by a visiting specialist to be a deliberate, highly technical modification, not a guess. Finch realized the secretary was a top-tier engineer. He ordered a final intensive search of her cell, the potting shed, and all surrounding areas, convinced a micro-transmitter must be hidden somewhere. Aiko, now certain that her time was limited, waited in her cell. She saw the light of the search parties, the flashlights moving like erratic fireflies across the compound. She had done her part. She had given the enemy the information they needed to defend themselves against the one weakness her nation had designed. She had made a choice based on the logic of survival, not for herself, but for the information itself, the only thing of value she carried. The irony of the situation was a masterpiece of wartime espionage. The Japanese spy had delivered a critical technological warning to the Allies, and the only person who could translate the warning from a botanical drawing to a strategic reality was an overworked primary school teacher. Ms. Atherton, the teacher, picked up the drawing. She frowned, marking a bold red X over the bizarre addition, circling the 235 MHz lambda, and writing in her meticulous cursive, "Nonsense, Eleanor. Focus on your botany." The technical truth, the life-saving frequency, was almost dismissed as a child's folly. But Ms. Atherton was a mathematician. She looked closer at the three tiny, non-aligned dots on the third petal. They were too precise to be a smudge, and the number 235 was, to her academic mind, suspiciously clean. Most importantly, the lambda symbol was universally recognized as the mathematical constant for wavelength. Ms. Atherton had a contact. Her brother, a decorated Navy signals officer stationed at the nearby Portsmouth base, on temporary leave due to an injury. On her break, driven by a nagging sense of mathematical unease, she took the drawing to him. "Look at this, Charles. The child is normally quite clever, but what is this nonsense? It feels like an equation, but it's pure biological drawing." Charles, the signals officer, saw the drawing. He saw the circled 235 MHz and the lambda symbol. His mind, honed by years of working with radar and radio, immediately dismissed the child's context and focused on the number. 235 MHz. It was a common, low-band frequency. But then he saw the three tiny dots. "A three-part cipher," he murmured, his curiosity piqued. "And the frequency is precise, not rounded." Charles took a massive professional risk. He took the drawing back to his base. A quick check of classified GEE operational manuals confirmed a chilling fact. 235 MHz was the precise, rarely discussed frequency used in a 30-second initial stability test of the GEE pulse. It was the system's handshake frequency, known only to the top echelon of the technical command. If the Germans hit that frequency during the handshake, the entire system would crash, and Allied bombers would be flying blind. The technical analysis was flawless. The source, however, was a child's botany project. The immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by a surge of panic. An alert was immediately raised, not against a physical attack, but against an electromagnetic one. The British High Command had received its warning, not through a codebreaker or a high-level defector, but through a child's plea for connection and a botanist's sense of detail. The intelligence machinery was now in frantic motion. The information, the critical frequency, 235 MHz, was authenticated against the original GEE design schematics. The discovery, traced back through the signals officer to the primary school, and ultimately to the prisoner facility, became the most protected secret of the war's final year. The narrative was simple. An intercepted German message provided the frequency. No mention of a child, a drawing, or a Japanese POW. The institutional ego of the Allied forces could not afford the truth. They had been saved by a despised enemy and a 10-year-old girl. Major Finch was informed only that the prisoner, Subject 94T, was to be placed under maximum security, her value now measured in absolute silence. He was ordered to cease all interrogation and to maintain the facade of her irrelevance. Finch, a shrewd operator, understood. The woman was a technological goldmine, but her capture was also a catastrophic embarrassment. The test of the frequency was scheduled for a massive daylight bombing raid over the Ruhr Valley, Operation Thunderclap. This was the largest concentration of Allied air power since D-Day. If the German Klangbild jammer was deployed, the 235 MHz frequency would be its target. The British prepared a countermeasure. A highly directional, ultra-high-power noise-jamming pulse, code-named Hush, tuned to 236 MHz, designed to overload the German jammer the instant it activated. It was a technological knife fight, a gamble of nanoseconds. In her isolation cell, Aiko Sato was acutely aware of the impending operation. The atmosphere of the compound was different. Too many high-ranking officers, too much static on the internal security channels, the distinct sound of high-frequency power generators being tested. She knew the Allies were responding to her warning. She also knew that if the warning was successfully used, her life was forfeit. She had served her purpose to the strategic balance, crossing the lines of her own allegiance to prevent a catastrophic, unnecessary slaughter. The irony reaches its zenith. Aiko's greatest patriotic service, the preservation of her country's cutting-edge intelligence, was achieved by risking her life to ensure the survival of her enemy's strategic air fleet, thereby maintaining the balance of power and prolonging the war. Her choice was one of technical integrity over immediate tactical victory. The day of Operation Thunderclap arrived. The sound of the massive B-17 and Lancaster formations was a deep, guttural roar that shook the very foundation of the prison annex. Ellie, now in London with her aunt, listened to the radio reports, her hands gripping the windowsill. She had done her part, and now the vast, invisible war was playing out around the tiny, fragile secret she held. Over the Ruhr, the Allied bombers began the GEE stabilization sequence. The 30-second window opened. Dr. Müller, the German engineer, sweating profusely in his fortified bunker in Essen, threw the master switch on the Klangbild jammer. The massive machine hummed to life, and the first, powerful pulse shot out, precisely on the 235 MHz frequency, the frequency his team had finally calculated based on months of intercepted Allied signals. At the exact same instant, the Allied hush countermeasure, activated on the tip-off from the child's drawing, triggered its own, infinitely more powerful pulse at 236 MHz. The resulting electromagnetic collision was not a signal, but an explosion of raw energy. The Klangbild jammer, hit with the unexpected counterpulse, was overloaded. Fuses blew, vacuum tubes imploded. The entire German early warning network in the sector went silent. The German operators, relying on their predictable superiority, were stunned into confusion. The Allied bombers, their GEE systems completely unscathed, continued on their vector with the accuracy of a Swiss watch. The raid was a resounding success, devastating the German industrial capacity in the Ruhr. The strategic intelligence stalemate was broken. Major Finch received the coded confirmation. He looked at the prisoner, Subject 94T, in her silent cell. He did not know the details of the communication, but he understood the result. The woman who thought no one wanted her had just saved the lives of thousands of Allied airmen. Finch entered Aiko's cell for the first time without a guard. He didn't speak the language of kindness, but of protocol. "The intelligence you provided, Subject," he said, his voice flat, "was accurate, highly effective." Aiko, sitting ramrod straight, simply nodded once. The war was still raging, but for her, the internal battle had found its fragile, terrifying resolution. The war did not end with Operation Thunderclap, but the technological advantage had decisively shifted back to the Allies. The German sixth sense was gone, and the Klangbild project was scrapped, deemed too vulnerable to the counter-techniques the Allies now mysteriously possessed. The final year of the European war was marked by air superiority and an almost perfect navigational efficiency, a legacy built on a moment of shared, silent vulnerability between a prisoner and a child. Aiko Sato, Subject 94T, was never repatriated to her home country. Following the Allied victory in Europe, her case became a profound diplomatic and intelligence nightmare. She was too valuable to release, yet too politically sensitive to imprison indefinitely. The official file was closed, labeled Classified, Transfer to Deep Cover Operations. She was erased from the record, becoming one of the nameless, permanent ghosts of the intelligence world. The official British narrative remains that the 235 MHz countermeasure was developed internally through advanced cryptanalysis. Major Finch retired quietly, his last official act being the burning of his personal, non-authorized notes on the case. He never spoke of the Japanese prisoner, but he carried the deep, unsettling knowledge that the war had been won by a technological advantage handed to them by a woman of profound technical skill, driven by a morality that transcended her own military allegiance. Eleanor Ellie Davies never forgot the woman who made the paper crane. The charcoal drawing of the Rosa Canina with its strange, technical label was kept, framed not in a formal manner, but hung in the back of her closet, a reminder of a profound, inexplicable secret. Ellie grew up to become a highly respected botanist, ironically specializing in the intricate, symmetrical patterns found in nature. She never understood the strategic weight of the 235 MHz frequency, but she understood the meaning of the gesture, a desperate message sent across an emotional abyss. Years later, in the late 1960s, a retired Ellie Davies was conducting field research in a remote, rainy corner of the English Lake District. She stopped for tea at a small, unassuming cottage. The woman who answered the door was older, her face lined with a history Ellie could only imagine, but her eyes held a familiar, distant intensity. On the mantelpiece of the cottage, there was a single, perfect piece of porcelain, a teacup, and next to it, an intricate, faded origami crane. The woman, the former Aiko Sato, looked at Ellie. The moment stretched, a long, unspoken connection between two people who had shared the most dangerous secret of the war. Aiko spoke, her voice still clipped, but devoid of the prison's enforced coldness. "You are the girl who drew the flower." Ellie simply nodded, her eyes watering. She was an adult, but the child's sense of duty and curiosity returned. "I still have the pin," Ellie whispered, referring to the rusted piece of metal she had used to scratch the checkmark. Aiko smiled, a slow, gentle curve that had never been seen by a British guard. The smile was not one of triumph or sorrow, but of acceptance. "Can you stay with us now?" Ellie asked again, the words echoing across the decades, this time not as a plea for the prisoner to remain, but as a simple, human offer of companionship. Aiko looked at the vast green landscape of the English countryside, a place that had become her permanent, silent sanctuary, paid for by the greatest gamble of her life. "I am already here," Aiko replied. "I have been here since the day you taught me the first lesson. The frequency of humanity is the one that cannot be jammed." The story of the Japanese POW woman in Europe is not a grand tale of marching armies, but a secret history of intellectual integrity, a profound ethical choice, and the simple, undeniable power of human connection. It is the story of a technological ghost saved by an innocent whisper, proving that in the most complex and brutal conflicts, sometimes the greatest victory is simply the choice to see the person behind the designation. Thank you for following this deep dive into one of the war's most fascinating and complex human stories. If this blend of technical detail and dramatic storytelling resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the hidden human costs of technological warfare. Your support allows us to continue bringing these meticulously researched histories to light.